Hello, everyone. Today's guest is Dr. Sean McDowell. He's a podcaster, YouTuber, and associate professor of Christian apologetics at the Talbot School of Theology of Biola University. Is there a God out there? If so, why doesn't he make himself more obvious to us? And how can we grow into relationship with him? We tackle some really big ones today, and Dr. McDowell has such helpful answers. I really enjoyed this one, and I'm sure that you will too. Please welcome to the show, Dr. Sean McDowell. Dr. McDowell, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
You bet. Tucker, happy to do it.
Thank you. So I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about the idea of divine hiddenness. And I'm sorry, my opening question is a little longer than it would normally be, but I'm kind of stealing a little bit from Alex O'Connor's video on why he doesn't believe in God. So I'm just going to kind of present what he presents to you, and
Sure.
then we'll get started. Okay, so Alex O'Connor reads from Psalm 139, which reads, where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take my wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. And I believe he says in the NRSV, that is titled the Inescapable God. And then he goes on to talk about how he has kind of led his life in such a way that he has eagerly sought God. He wants badly for it to be true that there is a God. And yet, after attending Bible studies and churches and living with Christian roommates, he has never felt the presence of God. So he makes the argument that God, even though the Bible claims that God is apparent, that God is actually hidden and is not making himself obvious if he does exist. What do you think about that? Can you talk about divine hiddenness a little bit?
So I have nothing but respect for Alex, the way he carries himself, his thinking. He's obviously brilliant. And he's raising an age-old question that's certainly not new to him. You could say the problem of evil and divine hiddenness is possibly the oldest question. It's dealt with in the book of Job in different ways. Why doesn't God answer my prayers? Why is he suffering? Which is me. In some ways, God not answering prayers is God seeming to be absent. There's a lot of angles we could go with this, but in terms of that Psalms, it's interesting that it says, my hand will hold you. I am present with you, even in Sheol. But it doesn't describe how God does this. So Psalms is a book that is poetic by its very nature because it's songs, right? I mean, you see lots of language in there that describes God in a way that's clearly not meant to be taken literally, but there's a theological truth behind it. So it sounds to me from your description, although I haven't heard Alex break this down, so it's really less about him as it is about this, the way the question was framed, is we tend to have a certain expectation of what it means to experience God. We tend to have certain expectation of what it means for God to hold my hand and be present. And so it doesn't meet our expectations, and we assume that God is absent or hidden and doesn't exist. That's where, in some ways, we have to talk about our expectations tied to this. The other interesting thing is the largest category of Psalms are complaint Psalms. David's saying things like, God, why are you absent? Where are you? How come my enemies are destroying me? I would argue that built into the Judeo-Christian worldview is that God is sufficiently present, but also is seemingly absent many times. That's what the Psalms are for. So oftentimes when people are struggling with unanswered prayer, with physical pain, I'll say, just read the Psalms because it's consoling to know that God is with me, even if I don't feel him, even if he doesn't answer a prayer the way I want him to. And so I think there's certain assumptions often built into what it means to experience God, how God should speak, that I would push back on. And sometimes these assumptions come from just really bad theology that's within the church itself, certain things that we teach. And so then I would also talk about the positive evidence that I think God has given in the world, and we could get into that.
Yeah, of course. Can you talk a little bit more about where you think the maybe the everyday expectation of what interacting with God looks like has gone wrong? Like how is the expectation that God would just present himself to us like a normal person? How is that mistaken?
I think a couple things come to mind. Number one, when we read the Bible, it just feels like God is doing these supernatural things from one moment to the next. We don't realize that we are getting a small slice of God's activity that focuses on his divine action, leading the people where it needs to go. We don't often think about the 400 years they're in slavery where we have no record of God doing anything supernatural. I'm not saying he didn't, but we don't focus on that season. We don't focus on where Samuel is born. And it says, I forget if it says where either miracles or words from God or prophecies are rare in this day. What does that mean? We don't focus on the intertestamental period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, where there's maybe 400 years. And obviously, stuff took place in that time, but because we have a small slice of God working through Abraham and working through Moses and working through the prophets and working through Jesus and the apostles, we tend to think that that's the norm of how things should be all the time. And we don't take a step back and put in context historically and theologically what God is doing. I think that might be a piece of it, just bad reading of the scriptures. I think the other piece is within modern day evangelicalism, I think we have an imbalanced view that overemphasizes experiencing God in an emotional kind of level. And some of this is reflected in our language. Talk about having a relationship with God. Now, in principle, I'm not opposed to that language because what does Jesus say in John 17? This is eternal life, that they may know you, the one true God. That's not head knowledge. That's not experiential knowledge like riding a bike. That's personal knowledge. We can know God personally, right? Acts 17, Paul talks about the unknown God, I'm going to proclaim to you, this God is known. But we don't talk about what does it mean to know God? What should we expect? What does it mean to have a relationship with God? So we often fill in certain things. And frankly, sometimes it's bad theology that I see all the time in the evangelical church. So I think there's this unhealthy desire to emotionally experience God in a certain fashion that leads people towards thinking, if I don't have that kind of experience, I don't know God. And I want to say, I'm not sure that necessarily falls. I think there's certainly times where we have powerful emotional experiences with God. I'm not playing that down, but that's not the basis of my faith. That's not what it means to know God, my level of emotional fervor. So we'll hear with students, if somebody's really found God, we say that person is on fire for the Lord. And really, we mean something about their level of like emotional expression in worship. And I'm like, that's great. But that's not necessarily the sign of discipleship. So I think it comes from bad reading of scripture, certain things within evangelical culture that set up a certain kind of experience of God that I'm not sure is biblical.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Can I kind of track back a little bit to something you were saying earlier? You were talking about how we get slices of history throughout the Old and New Testament where these miraculous events are occurring, and that there are huge chunks of time where it's not like that. There aren't pillars of fire leading the Israelites around. But can you talk a little bit about why, if I think the argument would be we're an atheist in the room, um, well, if God wants to be in relationship with us, with the people he created as like expressed in the Bible, why are there hundreds of years of silence where we don't hear from God, where there aren't these miraculous wonders to give us a sure knowledge of his presence and goodness?
Totally fair question. I'd say a few things. Yes, God has to sufficiently make himself known, but it doesn't always move from God making himself clear to more people following him.
Hmm.
Even in the scriptures, go to Exodus 32. What happens? They're out of Egypt. They leave in the earlier chapters in Exodus. I think right after Exodus 14 or so, they flee out, cross the Red Sea. And then Moses goes up and is, getting the 10 commandments from God. And what do the people do? They start worshiping another golden calf.
Hmm.
So it's not that they lacked evidence that God existed. For whatever reason, they were bringing back other failed ideas that they had and didn't like what this God required them to do.
Hmm.
You also see in the story of Lazarus. I mean, and this is only in John, really 11 and 12. I think it crops up the end of John chapter 10,
Hmm.
where, they come to Jesus and say, the one you loved has, he's dead. And Jesus weeps. He wept. He comes and 4 days later, after he's dead, what does Jesus do? And the religious leaders are there, calls him out of the tomb, even though people are laughing at him. And how do the people respond? You're right, Jesus. I'll follow you. Let me worship God. No, that's not what they do. They want to kill Lazarus, right? Poor guy already died once. And they want to run Jesus out of town. So it's natural to want a sign. It's natural to want evidence. Makes perfect sense. I do. But I think we assume if God just made himself clear in the way I want him to, more people would follow. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. It also assumes that the ultimate barrier when it's all said and done is intellectual and that there might not be other components at play as well.
Hmm. Can you talk? Why do you think it is then that people can witness like signs and miracles and still not believe, not have faith? I suppose there could be a multitude of answers to that question. But I feel like a lot of people nowadays would at least assert that if they saw someone they knew had died come back from the dead, or they saw a pillar of fire from the sky leading them to refuge, then they might assert that that would be enough. Um,
Well, people would certainly assert that, but the test would be if that really happened, if they believe or not. And the record we have there at history is some believe, many don't.
hmm,
I mean, I was actually having a conversation, when I was teaching high school full time, took a group of students up to Berkeley, and my high school students had this public engagement with some Berkeley students. So, like high school students and these brilliant Berkeley students. And one of my students said, what would it take for you to believe? And I'll never forget this guy. He said, I just want to see a miracle. And then he paused and he goes, well, I'm not sure if that would really convince me. Then I'd probably think that I was on drugs or my brain was playing tricks on me.
hmm,
Now, I'm not saying that's how every atheist would respond, but I don't know that we appreciate and understand the power of worldviews and beliefs. This is true for all of us. It's hard to change belief systems for a lot of reasons. It can be painful and costly to do so, Christian or not. We all have a tendency to interpret certain things through a particular lens. So I think we underestimate. Even I've done recent study on near-death experiences, and A.J. Ayer, I'm not actually sure how to say his last name, influential atheist, had a powerful near-death experience, which changes a lot of people in their beliefs. And it didn't change his belief. He continued on as a materialist.
hmm. Wow, that's very interesting. Thank you. So, how should one go about seeking God in a way that doesn't demand a supernatural wonder? How are we to know God if He's not gonna sit down in the chair across from us and be like, "Hey, I'm God. Nice to meet you." How are we supposed to kind of engage with this being that is so beyond us?
It's a great question, and some people might not like this answer, but I'm a Christian and I think Christianity is true. So I would invite somebody who's open to this to just say, consider reading one of the Gospels, and I love Gospel John, and just ask yourself, who is this person Jesus? Where does his authority come from? What do you think about his teachings? Why has this man who had a public ministry, maybe 2 to 3 years, and who didn't write any books or have any government or military power and probably traveled, I don't know, 100 to 150 miles in his life, why do more people call themselves followers of him than anyone who's ever existed? What is it about this person? And what's interesting is most other religions want to claim Jesus for themselves. Buddhists will say he's enlightened. Hindus will often say, well, he is a incarnation of a god. Muslims, it's canonical to Islam that he's born a virgin, lived a sinless life, and performed miracles. many New Agers, I mean, many atheists have respect for the person of Jesus, even though they obviously don't think he's God. I would just simply start there. Of course, you can look at some of the evidence from science and philosophy, and in some ways, it's a cumulative case to me. And I think the weight of the evidence points in the probabilistic direction of God existing. You can't prove it, it's not certain. And some people are more inclined towards scientific arguments, philosophical, historical. So you got to know your own kind of proclivities, but also don't think it's just an intellectual quest. Our relationships are a part of it, our emotions are a part of it, our will is a part of it. I mean, Jesus said some pretty radical things about what we do with our time and our money and our bodies and our words, our lives, calls us to something radical. And so there's a proverb that says, I think it's Proverbs 25. It says, the purposes in a man's heart are deep, and a person of wisdom draws it out. So for somebody who's seeking, I would say, consider praying or talking to others and really trying to ask, what is the root of my objection to God? And our tendency is to say, well, it's just intellectual. And that's certainly a piece of it. But I found there's often so much more at play than that, and try to get to the root of what that might be, and then be willing to address it accordingly.
Hmm. Thank you. This is a very interesting avenue to exploring the Christian religion that I haven't heard as much. I think something that I've heard a little bit more is the talk about seeing God through general revelation and witnessing Him in the world around us. I think you had, excuse me if I pronounce his name wrong, Dr. Doug Gruthis?
Grotice.
Grotice?
Yeah,
Thank
yeah,
you.
yeah.
I'm sorry.
You're not the first, and you won't be the last.
But he kind of talked a little bit about that, I believe, on your show. Could you talk a little bit about how that process, which seems like an alternative path to the same end, works? How do we witness God in the world around us?
Yeah, so that was a little while ago, and I think I had some of the big questions for him on hell and slavery and evil, if I recall. I've had him on twice.
Okay, yes. It was a top 10 most difficult
Yes.
objections to
Okay,
Christianity, I believe.
that's right. So he has a book, which is in many ways my go-to book on Christian apologetics. It's called Christian Apologetics. It's in a second printing. He asked me to endorse it, and I heartily did. I've taken high school students through it, but we've also used it in our grad program. It's a good intermediate text. So if anybody wants to walk through the evidence, he covers everything related to apologetics. And he's a philosopher, so he's very careful, he's very smart. That's just a wonderful text to do so. And he basically walks through the different arguments. And this, I'm admittedly not remotely doing justice to these, but walks through things like the cosmological argument. People used to think the universe was eternal. Now we know through science in the 20th century, and also philosophical arguments, that the universe very likely had a beginning. It's not eternal. So the argument would be that cries out for a cause outside of the universe to bring it into existence that's powerful, personal, spaceless, timeless, changeless, etc. And then he moves into like the fine tuning that we've discovered also in the late 20th century, that there's certain laws of physics and cosmology that exist within a very narrow range, and the slightest change on these in the entire universe becomes inhospitable to life. Things like the law of gravity, or what's called the cosmological constant. Well, that seems to point arguably towards a fine-tuner, a mind that situated things within the unique razor's edge, like Frederick Hoyle, who coined the term Big Bang, said it seems like someone's been monkeying with physics. So you have the beginning of the universe, you have fine-tuning the universe, then you can look at things like DNA. And in DNA, it's really amazing. The average human body has, I think it's 30 trillion cells. In each cell, the DNA, if you uncoiled it, would be about 2 meters, 6 feet in length. That means all the DNA in your body and mine, we're probably both very average sized, all things considered. Average human body, the DNA strung together would go from here to the sun and back about 200 times.
Oh my gosh.
And DNA stores information far more sophisticated and complex than any nanotechnology that I'm aware of. Well, it's like the beginning of the universe points towards a beginner, fine-tuning points towards a fine-tuner, the information arguably points towards an information giver, a mind. Now, I'm not going to walk through all of these, but then there's other arguments from that seem to be science-based, like the Cambrian explosion and the information input. There's things like irreducible complexity, etc. And there's responses to these, and these debates go on and on. But then there's certain philosophical arguments, like the argument from morality. If there's objective moral laws and duties, that points towards a moral law giver, so to speak, a mind. You can point to the argument from beauty. If there's objective beauty, and we certainly all talk like there is, as if a rose is beautiful, or a sunset is beautiful, or a solar eclipse is beautiful, that seems to point towards a divine artist. We could point towards consciousness. How does consciousness, let alone self-consciousness, emerge from matter? It seems to be something from nothing, but makes sense if there's a universal consciousness. So these are the kinds of arguments of natural theology where we're not using the Bible, we're not using the church, we're not using Jesus. We're looking at the origin of the universe, fine-tuning the universe, the existence of right and wrong, morality, beauty, DNA, etc. And then the question becomes, if there's a mind behind the universe that seems to care about moral behavior, has this mind made himself known? Of all the great religious figures, Jesus claimed to be God in human flesh, and then did miracles, fulfilled prophecy, lived a sinless life to back up those claims, and arguably has the credentials to speak as God. That's, I don't know how long I talked for, 4 or 5 minute summary of the case that Grotius gives that I think is powerful from natural revelation to the person of Jesus.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And we're running out of time, but I do have one more question for you. And just to kind of bring us full circle, go back to Alex O'Connor, and not to harp on him.
Sure.
Like you said, of course, have the greatest respect for him. He's so humble and so eloquent, and so willing to just engage with whoever about this topic. So great respect to him. But what would you say to someone maybe who, like him, has a little more experience with Christianity, whether they've never been a Christian or maybe apostatized from Christianity, and they say, "Oh, I've read the Bible and I've been to church and I've been to Bible study, and I've just never felt that there's sufficient evidence, sufficient experience, and I want to believe that God is real and that what the Bible says is true, but I'm struggling with that." What would next steps be for someone with that kind of experience? What would you encourage?
Well, I think it's very different somebody who's apostatized versus somebody
Sure.
who's an atheist and has never believed.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah.
So somebody's apostatized, I want to hear their story. When did you believe? And frankly, in the vast majority of cases of people that I've talked to, I don't know that they ever really experience God's grace in the first place. I cannot and will not judge people's hearts. Only God can do that. But it's amazing how many people I've asked, tell me about that time you knew you were a sinner and you cried out to God for his grace and you felt that you were a new creation. It's amazing how many people who've apostatized and left are like, well, I didn't have that experience, but I experienced God in nature or worship or something else. And I want to go, okay, you were part of the club, but that's what it means to be a Christian. So is it possible that you've left a straw man of this you never really knew in the first place? Is that possible? That's where I'm going to go with it. And maybe that's not going to work for that person, and I'm just going to listen to them. I'm going to ask, why did they apostatize? And many times what I find, again, not always, is there's so often emotional hurt that's there. There's relational hurt. There's bad theology. I want to find out what the root of it is and try to get to it if they're open to it. Oftentimes there's relational hurt. And sometimes there's really good questions that need to be answered. So that's how I would address that. As far as somebody like Alex, I've seen some of his videos, only respect. I don't know enough about where he's coming from to say, but if we sat down, I'd just say, okay, tell me your story and tell me your first experience with Christianity and tell me what your doubts are. And like, I would just ask a lot of questions and I would just try to listen and I would try to understand and present Jesus in a way that's compelling. That's it. I mean, I don't people can have a lot of different reasons for not believing. And someone like Alex, this complete speculation, because he's so thoughtful, might be tempted to think, as I do, that this is an intellectual route alone. But there's so much more to it emotionally and spiritually and morally and personally and relationally of what it means to change your life and your identity and follow Jesus. So I'd want to have a holistic conversation about where he's at.
Wow, that's a very thoughtful answer. Thank you so much, Dr. McDowell. If someone wanted to see more of what you do, where can they go online or maybe books that you've written?
So the central hub would be seanmcdowell.org, and I have links to a blog I do weekly, links to my YouTube channel, usually update a couple of videos a week. Conversations like this, usually an hour plus, sometimes with skeptics and atheists and agnostics, etc. I'm all over Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Got a ton of different books on different areas that might interest folks. If somebody's listening and they were that person who apostatized and was a believer, the one book I would encourage is a book I wrote called Set Adrift, which is for Christians who have deconstructed, not so much have left their faith and come back, but try to just separate what questions should we ask? What does it really mean to follow Jesus? How do I separate certain cultural ideas I've adopted from what the Bible really teaches and what it means to follow Jesus? That book in particular might be helpful to that person.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Great questions.